Hi, my name is Dr. Vilija Jokubaitis and I am a research fellow at the Melbourne Brain Centre at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Today I want to talk to you about some of the research that we do using databases, and in particular the database that I work with, which is called MSBase. MSBase, many of you might have heard about it before, is an outcomes registry of people with multiple sclerosis. So what this database is really good at doing is following up people who have multiple sclerosis over the long term. And in the database, we have people that have been followed with multiple sclerosis for many, many years, and in fact decades in some instances. It's actually the largest international registry of people with MS, and there are patients from multiple countries all over the world, about 33 at present, that are all contributing their clinical data. Of course, people have consented to being part of this. So all of the data that we have there that's available for analysis is from people that are fully consented for the process. We've used this data in a number of different ways and for a number of different studies. You might have heard one of my colleagues, Tomasz Kalinczyk, speak previously about his research looking at the effectiveness of different therapies in the real world. But my research is a little bit different, has a slightly different focus. The research that I do particularly focuses on understanding what predicts people's outcomes with multiple sclerosis. So we know that outcomes for people with MS are really different. Some people have relatively mild disease with very few relapses over the course of many decades. And unfortunately, we know that some people also have very severe disease and disabling disease that develops quite quickly. Of course, most people are somewhere in between this scale. And unfortunately, at present, we're not very good at predicting who's going to do well and who's going to do poorly, particularly at the start of the disease. And it often takes many decades for us to really understand what a person's disease will end up looking like. So the research that we do with the multiple sclerosis database MSBase is trying to identify clinical predictors of disease outcome over many years. And into that we also model things such as the effectiveness of therapy and the effect of pregnancy, for example, whether or not pregnancy is good in the long term for women with MS or neutral or otherwise. And so we've actually quite successfully used this database to answer some of these questions, looking at long-term outcomes data, and published some of that work recently in the Annals of Neurology. But what we're really interested in now is actually combining this clinical data within the database with biological data. And so what we want to do is we want to see whether or not we can see if there is something in a person's DNA that determines what their disease will be like in the long term. So using the database that we have with other researchers that are also interested in genetics, we've actually written a mathematical algorithm or a mathematical formula that is able to take all of that information that we have about people with MS over a really long period of time. And the mathematical formula that we've developed actually stratifies people as having mild, moderate or severe disease. So basically the patient cohort that we're looking at is divided into thirds. And so using this, we are now recruiting patients to our study who are interested in participating in genetic studies. And we, after we consent them to be part of the process, we're actually using the algorithm that we've previously identified to categorise them into either mild, moderate or severe group. The purpose of this is to see whether or not, when we group people in a particular manner, to see whether or not there are similarities in terms of the DNA or their genes within those groups, and to take an extreme example, if we took the mild group and the severe group, to see whether or not there are any genetic differences that we could attribute towards having an influence on a person's disease outcome. So this is some of the research that we're currently doing. It's an international collaboration as well, so taking advantage of the international nature of the database that we're involved with. And we are currently recruiting patients to the study, and we are, as we speak, also genotyping some of these patients' DNA. So in other words, reading the DNA code of those patients. So within the next 6 months or so, we should have some preliminary data which should tell us whether or not we can actually use both a combination of clinical outcomes databasing as well as biology to help us better predict people's outcomes in the future. So the idea behind this genetic research is that we're trying to identify genetic predictors of a person's likely long-term disease outcome. Now, unfortunately, it's not actually going to help those people that are participating in this research, but we're hoping that it'll help people newly diagnosed with MS. The idea behind this project is that if we can identify a genetic difference between people who have, for example, mild and severe MS or mild and moderate MS, then we might be able to one day develop a genetic test that we could offer to newly diagnosed patients. Here we would be able to identify the likely outcome for these patients, so whether they're likely to have mild, moderate or severe disease, and that way we'd be able to improve clinical management and offer better recommendations in terms of treatment options for individuals, thereby improving everybody's quality of life. The other things that might come out of this research is that we might also gain better understandings into which drugs work better for which people, whether or not there is a genetic reason why some people respond to certain MS therapies and not to others. And the other thing is that the biology of MS is in some respects still a bit of a black box. So we're hoping that this research might also help us understand a little bit more about the biology of MS.